Okay, just going to get all organized here. So good evening and thank you for joining us tonight. For those of you who are attending the speaker series this evening for the first time, I want to thank you and just say a few words about who we are and who I am and what it is that we do. So first off, my name is Neil Orlowsky and I'm the Director of Education and Chair of Global Education for the Abraham Global Peace Initiative. The Abraham Global Peace Initiative is a Canadian human rights organization comprised of leading parliamentarians, social society leaders, law enforcement individuals, and educators. Our mission, while standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us, is to assist, encourage, and promote, whether on our own or in conjunction with others, the advancement of human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy, global peace, and civil society in Canada, the Middle East, and around the world. Tonight's discussion not only defines some of the key terms that I find are creeping into the mainstream conversation, like white supremacy and anti-racist education, but goes further in attempts to contextualize the Jewish experience in it as a case study and example of how some of the othered bodies become veiled, negated, and encompassed as part of or in conjunction with the mainstream norm. Given that, I call talk the Audacity of Accusations. Now, this stems from former US President Barack Obama's second book, The Audacity of Hope, where his title derived from a late 1980s lecture by Frederick Sampson based on a G.F. Watts painting, Hope. In a 1990s sermon by former Obama pastor Jeremiah Wright, Wright preached, and based on the painting, that with her clothes in rags, her body scared and bruised and bleeding, her harp all but destroyed and with only one string left, she had the audacity to make music and praise God. To take the one string you have left and to have the audacity to hope. The last 6 months have been a trying time for both Israelis and Palestinian activists, whose work often became co-opted by the sharing of reductionist talking points, diminishing and calling into question lived realities of Jews as a collective and Palestinians as a people, and the experiences that they both endured. Well, there's been much debate about education and in turn, the mainstream media about whose stories and histories are valid. Many took the bold risk to speak out, to speak up and rattle the proverbial cage of this is just the way we've always done things. This audacity, while at times contentious, polarizing, and led to the militarization within schools and social media, really unveiled a common wound. Many of our students and our educators began to ask, where are we authentically in this story? And who is telling our story if not us? This reminds me of the African proverb that states that until the lion learns to speak, the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Well, we talk of centering students in curriculum, centering and validating their experiences and their pathways. But in recent months, I feel we're shouting down each other. We're failing to listen and we're failing to engage with the other in dialogues between intersecting histories and narratives. So I ask, are we hunters speaking on behalf of all of the lions? For tonight's discussion, I'm focusing only on one side of the wound, the Jewish experience, but I really want to stress that this is just that, the Jewish experience, and that is not the only side of the large connected web needed to understand history as it's still happening. Tonight's conversation is grounded and grounding this experience in the new realities of the woke movement. By woke, because it's come to my attention, some people are not familiar with the term woke, I'm not referring to woke by the original conception of the term, meaning one's alertness or awareness to racial prejudices and discriminations, and thus the movement of a broader awareness of social inequalities and sexism and identity politics and social justice, for example, white privilege. But I'm using the term woke as a tool of virtue signaling and a movement that really has co-opted the work of the woke in appearing to support progressive causes as a substitute for genuine action and socio-political reform of insincere performative activism. This goes back to my previous question of who's telling our story if not us? Who's telling the Palestinian story if not the Palestinians? Who's telling the Israeli or Jewish narratives if not the Israeli or Jewish citizens? How are they, meaning the other, using our experiences to shape their cause, their lenses, and their agenda? Terms like canceling or deplatforming or microaggressions and safe spaces are poking into daily conversations, and individuals are needing to be more sensitive to sensitivities, to privileges and preference, yet we find ourselves, again, shouting each other down when we be sitting down with each other and listening. This then is what brought me to examine the audacity of accusations and then grapple with claims of Jews gaining access to and having bestowed upon them privileges of white supremacy, and thus no longer seeing their history and concerns with the growing normalization of anti-Semitism within equity work and anti-racist education. And here, when I make claims like that, I'm referring specifically to ETFO, or the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. I'm making specific reference to the Ontario Principals Council, who both have removed anti-Semitism from their equity training focus, when at the same time, Jewish students on campus who call out anti-Semitism are countered with claims and equivalencies of oppression Olympics. By this, I'm referring to comments made in conversation with Queen's students, Western University students, and those comments made to me at York University and within TDSB and York Region. Sadly, anti-Semitism has been the oldest form of hate, and Jews continue to prevail, practice in public while repeatedly being outed and targeted for their belief. While it's important to note that, again, Jews are not the only target of such hate, and that becomes the key theme. I'm only looking tonight through the context and lens of Jews, but by no means is it only endemic to us. Tonight, that's my focus. And if you are not Jewish, or even if you do work in diversity, equity, and inclusivity, I want you to try to contextualize how the same claims manifest, not just towards Jews and Muslims, but whites and blacks, 2S LGBTQ plus community members, gender, and so on. In this new wave of anti-Jewish hate and what I call the third incarnation of anti-Semitism, Jews are themselves embroiled in calls to cancel white privilege, to dismantle white supremacy, and as mentioned, no longer one of the focal bodies like the anti-racism movement, no longer a focal body like the anti-LGBTQ plus or anti-Indigenous racism of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusivity training programs. So I'm using terms like white supremacy and white privilege and anti-racism education, but what do these terms mean and how am I understanding them in my lens? The phrase white supremacy has increasingly crept into the rhetorical bloodstream of both social and mainstream media. We hear calls of white supremacy and leaders or companies being or engaging in white supremacist activity. Well, I've always been grappling with this term because as a Jew versus an academic, I have a very different understanding of what the term white supremacist means. For me, I hear white supremacy and I think of hooded rednecks, burning crosses. I think of brown shirts, goose stepping down the streets. But in the Mississippi burning, in the triumph of the will, Riefenstahl-esque lens, this really doesn't summarize where we are today. We're not burning crosses on the street of Toronto. We're not goose stepping across the fields in Thornhill, though we know students were doing it in North Bay 3 weeks ago. So why, when we talk about white supremacy, are we also including Jews within that space, inside that privileged mold? And how did we get to be there? Well, white supremacy is characterized as a belief system whereby whites should, 4 things. 1, have dominance over people of other backgrounds, especially where they coexist. 2, whites should live by themselves in a white-only society. 3, white people have their own culture that is superior to other cultures. And 4, white people are generally or genetically superior to other people. So I scratch my head and I look in the mirror and I question this. As a full-fledged ideology, white supremacy is far more encompassing than simple racism and bigotry. White supremacy is the water that we're all swimming in. The issue is that we don't see it. There's a story that fish don't see. Fish don't know that they're in water. And if you tried to explain to a fish what water is, they'd say, "Water? What's that?" They're surrounded by it, but it's impossible to see it. And it's only once they jump out and are lying on the beach that they realize it's too late. White supremacy is the idea or the ideology that white people and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, the actions of white people are superior to those people of color. But don't be confused. You don't have to be white to follow a white supremacist mindset in order to hold these beliefs, because we've all and I know that we're not all in Toronto, but we've all been conditioned collectively within I'm going to use the term Canadian or Western society. We watch TV that has very specific gender norms. We identify who's being cast for what roles. How obvious are certain tokenistic hirings? And so we look at this and we think about how conditioned we've been through exposure to media, to parenting, to schooling, and our interactions within these power structures. But all this in hand, I think the question is, are Jews white? Or maybe better yet, how are Jews white? And for me, this idea is rooted, and if you've been part of my speaker series before, you've heard me use the term Ashkenormativity. The idea for me is rooted in this Ashkenormativity, the idea that all Jews are seen as Ashkenazi, seen as European, and therefore by skin pigmentation, they must be white. But what about the Sephardic Jews? What about Mizrahi Jews, right? Who are often asked that when they announce that they're Jewish, people say, "When did you convert? You're Black, you can't be Jewish." This to me is that Ashkenormativity. This is a privilege question. And I'm going to look at privilege in a moment, but I'm talking about really this hierarchy of race. If we learn about race and whiteness at the top, and we know that other racialized bodies fit the different rungs in the ladder, and yes, I'm going downwards. The question is, how did Jews go from here to here, or where are they? I'm talking about the hierarchy of race, and And some white supremacists have really singled out Jews for their collusion with oppressive powers, criticizing that the range from inflammatory condemnation of Israel to full conspiracy theories that we created COVID, that we own the media, that we own the banks. In speaking about Jewish whiteness, though, there are two camps. On the extreme, sorry, I'm going to my left, but on the extreme right, Jews are seen as impure, a full white race that has tainted communities and societies. On the extreme left, Jews are seen as part of a white majority, established or a white establishment that seeks to dominate people of color. Proverbially, you understand what I'm saying, Jews were never seen as racialized, but they were never seen as white. And so as they began to assimilate, there were some calls that Jews were trying to take the privilege of white without giving it to the racialized. They were almost the reverse Robin Hood. As such, Jewish identity is inherently paradoxical. It's contradictory. And what you have seen is a group that was historically considered, and I would say still is considered, an outed group, a persecuted minority that in the span of really only 2 generations have become one of the most successfully integrated other groups in society. When I'm talking about 2 generations, what I'm looking at is really from the 1930s to today. So in the last 90 years. So this would encompass the Holocaust, with greater intention being placed on social and racial injustices, and in efforts to align and expose allies and enemies. The question of Jews and whiteness illustrates the dangers of racial politics. The truth is that Jews don't fit neatly into a racial category, and that Jews are challenged when we're attempting to conceptualize, is Judaism my religion or is Judaism my ethnicity? In 1991, the Canadian census listed Jewishness as an ethnic group, not a religion. Over time, Jews became more integrated into society, a process that many scholars have referred to as the process of becoming white. It wasn't the skin color of Ashkenazi Jews. It was status. So skin color never changed, but status in society did, and this racial status is much more ambiguous. During the peak of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe in the late 1900s and earliest parts of the 20th century, many Jews lived in tightly knit urban communities, really marked and a separate culture from other cultures. Jewish immigrants spoke Yiddish. We published our own language newspapers. We started our own Jewish kosher stores, delis, butchers, and so on. We followed our own schedule of holidays and celebrations. Those boundaries were further reinforced and ostracized by widespread anti-Semitism, whereby Jews were often excluded from taking certain jobs. They were excluded from joining certain clubs or moving into certain neighborhoods. Insofar as whiteness represented acceptance into a dominant culture, historically, Jews weren't there yet. So, over time, Jews assimilated. They moved to the suburbs. They took advantage of educational opportunities. And in many cases, they became part of that emerging middle class. For all intents and purposes, Jews thought, and really I would say that society perceived them as becoming white. White passing, based on the notion that they can pass as a white person because of skin color, or functionally white because they were able to take advantages of some of the opportunities that were really only available for white bodies. Many of them stopped speaking Yiddish. Many of them stopped going to synagogue, stopped wearing the trimmings of Jewishness. As Jews further assimilated into Western culture, again, the perception was that they were white rather than ethnically Jewish. So privilege, on the other hand, is really just that. The privilege of to an individual based on skin color. Now, I'm not going to lie. I look in the mirror and I know what color stares back at me. While I may not consider myself white, unlike Frantz Fanon's black skin, white mask, I can hide my heritage. I can tuck my Magen David necklace into my shirt. I don't have to worry about being directly harassed for my Jewness. I may choose to remove my kippah or tuck in my tzitzit, both of which would be sacrilegious, but it is possible. On the other hand, racialized bodies are not afforded that privilege. You can't remove the color of your skin. And so the question then becomes, how does race manifest in society? How is it outed in education? And what are we doing with it? Because policing in schools, carding, it's easy for me to say that I don't have an issue with it because historically and statistically, those that look like me are not on the receiving end of these privileges. I may be Jewish, but I'm afforded the privilege of not having to worry. So would I feel different if I was? Given that functionally or white passing Jews may benefit from being perceived as white. Yet Jewish identity, and for those of us who are Jewish and have grown up Jewish, know that we are marked, our identity, our psyche is founded in a sense of a history of persecution, a history of exile, a history of extermination that stick to your own because it's easier that way, that, you know, the only one that will ever like you are those like you. So in essence, and in the words of a good friend of mine, George Day, white privileges are the unearned advantages that white people enjoy that allow them to gain access to resources, which is unequal to other racial groups in Canada. The truth is, though, that Jews grapple with race, and in fact, many have been on the forefront of the struggles for racial equality, like the civil rights movement, and yet there is no doubt that while we were fighting for racial equality, we were also the recipients of white privilege. From this is the third idea, the third term that I want to define, and that's anti-racism education. Originally emerging in the 1960s, thanks to Black community activism, the goal was to address racism and other related systems of social oppression in institutions like school. In doing it, interrogates and works to dismantle white supremacy and colonialism as factors behind today's systemic racism, but today has also expanded to examine and address educational racism, issues of power, inequality, access, privilege, and equity. Ask yourself, when you were in school, who were the main characters in the books that you read? Did they look like you? Did they speak like you? Did their experience mirror your experiences? Whose history did you learn and whose side told the story. As educators, perspective matters. And when we fail to highlight all narratives in history, we fail to be a critical educator. I tell my students that if we're learning about American Thanksgiving and we begin the story with the pilgrims aboard ships coming across the Atlantic, landing on Plymouth Rock, we have a very different story than if we begin with the various tribes of the Wampanoag people who had lived near Plymouth Rock for 10,000 years before the settlers arrived, whose lives were uprooted and whose communities were destroyed. What is our entry point into these stories? And what is the motivation of telling these stories? Where all this comes to a head for the Jewish community, and in thinking about how oppression functions in our daily life, we need to understand intersectionality. So I know that some of us come from an equity background and some of us are in academia. So with terms like white supremacy and white privilege and anti-racism, and in this case, intersectionality, I'm aware that I'm sort of providing an overview and not necessarily the academic definition. So if you do happen to read Kim Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, she goes into a lot more depth, but this term intersectionality is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to explain how multiple systems of oppression play out in every individual's life and lived experience. Reflecting on yourself, your gender, your race, your sexuality, your creed, no one holds just one identity. For all of us, our self and perceived identities and our expressions of gender, of race, of class, of sexuality, religion, ethnicity, nationality, citizenship, ability, and so on, plays out in how we live our life and how we interact with people every day. I am a white, cis-normative Jewish male. My wife is a Chinese, cis-normative convert immigrant female from a small town in northern Manitoba. All of these shape A, how we see and how we experience the world, and B, how others see us and interact with us. We live at the intersection of multiple, often fluid identities. This helps us understand and explain how, as white, sometimes self-described as functionally or white passing, we can simultaneously experience privilege as white people while also experiencing oppression as Jews. Identities and oppression shift in different times and places. Anti-Semitism experienced by white Jews in Europe versus the United States 2 generations ago is not experienced the same way it is today. Anti-Semitism that plays out today in some parts of North America is not experienced the same way by all Jews. We need to be attentive to this and the ways that the current experiences of Jews and North Americans in North American life might differ from the experience of 1 generation or 2 generations in the past. And that said, it is not about oppression Olympics, but rather understanding, about contextualizing that what today's anti-Semitism looks like, and again, I'm only referring to one, reflects what I call the 3rd incarnation of anti-Semitism. So some of you have heard me talk about this before. I want you to think of it this way. In the Middle Ages, Jews were outed, hated, and subsequently killed or exiled for their religion and their beliefs. 1, 1st incarnation. In the mid-19th and 20th centuries, Jews were outed and hated for their race, which bore the label anti-Semitism and founded Hitler's final solution, or rather was embedded in Hitler's final solution. Today, in the mid-20th and 21st century, I would say that Jews are hated for their creation of. And please note, I'm not referring to all Jews because I know that we differ, and Jews, again, come in every every shape and size. I'm talking at a general level, so please excuse me with that. Jews are hated for their creation of, for their belief in, and support of the nation state Israel, which, turn to social media, has often been referred to or called an apartheid state, a colonial or settler colonial body, which is ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. Thus, anyone who believes in a sovereign Jewish state is indicted, and they are labeled as an insidious Zionist. If we think of this as a Venn diagram, so I apologize for going school on us, but if we can imagine this as a Venn diagram, we see the left circle, maybe that would be your left, we see the left circle as left-wing anti-Semitism, or what I call Hanukkah anti-Semitism. We'll do it this way. On the far right circle, we see what I call right-wing anti-Semitism, or Purim anti-Semitism. And I know that not all of us are Jewish or are familiar with Jewish stories, so let me take a moment and I want you to think. If we think about the story of Hanukkah, so that's that left-wing anti-Semitism, I want you to think about what's going on in the world today. The story of Hanukkah celebrates the tale of the Maccabees, who defeated the Greek king Antiochus's troops after a 3-year war. In efforts to consolidate his empire and to strengthen his hold over the region, King Antiochus outlawed Jewish religious rites and traditions that were kept by observant Jews. And he ordered that all Jews are to worship Zeus as the supreme god. In essence, Jews, you could still recognize your god Hashem, but you have to pray and worship Zeus. So Jews could not practice their faith, or if they could, it was done in restrictions. That's that left wing. On the other hand is the story of Purim, which in short speaks of Haman, an advisor who wanted to exterminate all of the Jews in the Persian Empire. So on one hand, we recognize you as long as you don't have to celebrate your traditions or do anything, you assimilate. On the other hand, we'll kill you. Left wing, right wing. Today, though, Jews are in some cases, and in other cases, really indirectly forced to choose to speak up or to speak out about anti-Semitism. And this choice really is founded in a fear of being shouted down or labeled a Zionist, equating Zionism with the state policies of Israel. Thus, if you're not a Zionist, you must support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. On the other hand, and we see this more than not, that Jews sit idly by, accepting the tolerable intolerance of anti-Semitism that has really led to the polarization among school staff, students, and larger society. Instead of taking sides, many of us have found it safer just to keep our mouths shut. To me, that's not only the left wing, but if we're fearing rebuttal, that's the right wing. So where we are today is being forced into the middle, where we have to make calculated moves. My question is, can you be pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian? Do we even need to choose one extreme in a zero-sum game? Can't you be both? I know that we have a lot of educators and stakeholders here with us tonight. So this question I'm about to ask is really for you. The purpose of I got to read this question. The purpose of anti-Semitism education is to question who has power in schools today and hold conversations with students to undo the legacy of white supremacy and privilege. Given the debate that erupted in May, following mailers and articles, how are identity, power, and privilege contextualized and applied for Jewish versus Palestinian students? And I'm using these descriptors intentionally, understanding Jewish is perceived as a religion and Palestinian as a people. I'm using that intentionally because the debate was not about Israeli-Palestinian in May. The debate emerged around Jewish and Palestinian. And how might boards of education, individual schools, and teachers themselves reflect on and create programs that acknowledge and invite as tenets of inclusivity the experiences and existence of all students without questions, without opposition, or without amputating one student's experience for another. Anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, by changing organizational structures and policies and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equally. Equally for all, not equally for some. Given the debate in May, was this done on both sides of the spectrum? Anti-racism education advocates for changes in the curriculum so that students can learn about the devastating consequences of colonization. But we failed, especially around Israeli-Palestinian history. We failed. We failed to acknowledge the history of colonialism in the region dates pre-1948. The whole of MENA, the whole of the Middle East and North Africa was colonized previously by Greeks, by Romans, by the Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans, and Europeans. So what happened to all bodies that were indigenous to the land during these consequences? So, for those of you who know me, know that I'm a geographer and I love maps and cartography. As a piece of homework, I ask you to do this. Look at how the borders are drawn on a map of the Middle East and North Africa. Do the borders follow the physical landscapes? Do they follow mountain ranges and rivers? Or are they straight? As if a foreign body drew them with a ruler. How might the borders of today compare to the same region during different colonial periods? Now, I know the answer. All you need to do is look at a map of continental Africa, a map of the Middle East, and compare it to South America. Compare it to Europe or Asia, and you'll see. It was other bodies that drew the borders in Africa, that drew the borders in the Middle East. So in the wake of the May 2021 Israel-Hamas conflict, though beginning years earlier, there was a racial reckoning of the conflict that forced many to deepen their understanding of racial injustice and thus forcing themselves into the imposition of a racial binary, which ascribed power to white people and powerlessness to people of color. The racialization of this conflict drew on such binaries and positioned state power as based on allies and notions of proportional or non-proportional responses, or lack thereof, without examining the history of the region and the players on the ground, namely how power was obtained, was it usurped, how was it intentionally used or abused, and how does one side use power against the other? Powerful nations, often labeled developed countries, we used to call these the first world countries, are seen as white countries, whereas those perceived as less powerful, formerly the developing world, formerly the third world countries, are seen as the racialized countries. In many cases, we can look north or south of the border, north or south of the equator. But in the case of the Middle East, where most of the countries actually are north of the equator, that's not the case. I call this dog whistling, or a dog whistling lens founded less on the oppression of bodies and more on rights of existence. Conversing with many on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian debate, many fail to note that Egypt and Jordan have taken steps to close borders and remove Palestinian citizenship from Palestinian refugees. The Lebanese government has forced Palestinian refugees to remain in refugee camps, refusing them the rights to land ownership and basic health care outside of camps. Iran has often been said to be fighting a proxy war with Israel through their siphoning of funds and weaponry to support Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's no secret that Iran has called for the destruction of Israel, and sadly, and this is my opinion, Iran are using Palestinians as political pawns, knowing that Israel is going to react. This is the blinder lens. But also, we need to be realistic. Speaking about Lebanon and Iran and Jordan and Egypt is not about shifting blame away from Israel. And that's the word I'm using, not about shifting blame away from Israel or being an apologist for the state. But rather, if we're talking about education and we're talking about creating a forum for debate and engagement with students, we need to be providing the whole story, not just bits and pieces that fit one narrative over another. I have no issue with welcoming anti-racist educators who want to teach the successes and values of many traditions around the world, not only those of Europeans. I think that it needs to be celebrated, but more so, I think that this approach to education needs to become part of our standard practice, as opposed to treating it as a tokenistic one-off. But what happens when we begin to pick and choose whose successes and whose struggles we're highlighting and at what expense to our students? We need to question the inequalities and the inequities that are inherent in our current education system. We need to question this so that students can see how these inherent inequities reflect inequality in society in general. And so we can't have these blinders on. Either tell the whole story or don't tell the story. There is an audacity in accusations, an audacity that, while shifting the needle, questions and forces towards the narrative of change really need to be unveiled. As a lived reality, the same way masses took to the streets following the murder of George Floyd, following the murder of Breonna Taylor, and those that came before them and those that followed, giving rise and fuel to the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw attempts by similar masses to redefine the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a racial power dynamic, casting Israel as an infinitely powerful state and the Palestinians as completely without agency or a capacity to act independently. And I think that that is dangerous. In layman's terms, this audacity shined light on white liberals that were pro-Israel, while the racialized, the marginalized, and the systemically oppressed seemingly sided with the Palestinians. Why do we need to take sides? Why can't we engage in constructive dialogue? Both narratives often took a minimalist, both narratives often took a reductionist approach to the long-standing history of both Israel and the Palestinians and the conflict itself. False equivalencies, and I know that what I'm about to say is contentious, but false equivalencies between apartheid South Africa and the policies of Israel were emerging in mainstream media, along with headlines like Israeli colonialist project, which was on the front page of the Washington Post. Furthermore, following the death of George Floyd, rumors circulated that the then Minneapolis police were trained by alleged Israeli Secret Service, referring to the way then police officer Derek Chauvin leaned on George Floyd's neck as an alleged tactic used by the IDF during the Second Intifada. A report was later issued by the Morning Star, a Minneapolis newspaper, stating that the report was actually subsequently misquoted. However, the damage was already done because movements remember choking. They don't remember retractions on page 17. White is a kind of cultural construct, a way of thinking of yourself and a way that other people think of you. Whiteness itself is very fluid and a contested category. Race is not just a matter of skin pigmentation or ethnic background. It's determined by both individuals and their observers, and the boundaries of who's in or who's out of a certain group. And all of this is changing constantly. The question of Jews, white supremacy, and anti-racism education is more a question of positionality and society, and the fluidity of hierarchies, and the illumination of debates. The bigger question really needs to be framed around whiteness, Judaism, and societal safety. If I'm Jewish and white, must I be a supporter of Israel because Jews are white, Israel is powerful, and thus A plus B equals C, right? But if we're talking about whiteness, and we're not calling into question white as a skin color, rather it's a category marking power, then we need to give the notion of power and the connection between Jews and the state of Israel some time. We need to question a need that arises as power and whiteness. How did that come to be? If Israel is now in a position of power, how is that power used geographically and geopolitically, which in turn forces an examination of who are our allies, how did they come to be, who are our enemies, and how did those come to be? Why I called this talk an Audacity of Accusations, Jews, White Supremacy, and Anti-Racist Education is twofold. There's been a lot of name calling and accusations made about political alignments of and by colleagues. We have called each other anti-Semitic. We have called each other Islamophobic. We've called one side anti-Zionist, or we've said that the other might have an anti-Palestinian agenda. This is harming our students, but more so it's harming our own psyche. What happened to teacher mental health? Secondly, I have an anti-racist agenda. There is no doubt that race, racism, and particular racial formations develop and permeate in and around classrooms and society. There is no doubt that an anti-racist lens explains the realms and experiences that both individuals and groups find themselves in and involved with within classrooms, within curriculum, within narratives and bias of educators. There is no doubt that racism tends to be a part of the institutional structures and mechanisms of which schooling was intentionally founded on. And once we created schools as inclusive buildings, we needed to find a new way to out, other, and perpetuate difference. We are at a crossroads, both in society and within education. We talk of safe and brave spaces. We talk about equity and inclusivity. But equally important is that many also feel uncomfortable. I'm not pro-Palestinian. I'm not pro-Israel. As much as I'm not anti-Palestinian or anti-Israel, to stake claim to one side is nonsense. They say that the wise begin by listening, not by interrupting. To achieve sustainable peace in the Middle East, we at the Abraham Global Peace Initiative are beginning with classrooms. We are speaking to teachers, to educators, to stakeholders. We must begin in the classroom and be weary of those who say that this is the way we've always done it, because those people are afraid of change. So thank you very much. And as I always say, spread hummus, not hate. My computer has frozen, so see if this works. Give me 1 sec. I do need to leave for one moment. Perfect timing to freeze, and I will be right back. Okay, so now, and again, I want to reiterate the fact that the only reason I had closed the chat was I wouldn't have been able to read it. So I've now enabled chat. If anybody would either like to ask questions, engage in a discussion, post something in chat, to me, I'd love to use any sort of remaining time to really discuss. I have very strong feelings about what has happened in education in the last 6 months. And where I think as educators, we need to do better. So when we talk about the audacity, it's really the nerve to rattle that cage, right? And sometimes the way we're going about things are not correct, but it exposes that conversations need to be had. That's all I'm going to say on the matter. For those of you who may not have any questions or believe they're good, I wish you all the best. A reminder, and I guess I shouldn't say reminder because I haven't posted, on November 1st, we're going to be running an additional speaker series on Indigenous creation stories. So look forward to that poster going out soon. Unfortunately, I have some marking to do in the meantime. So I see some hands up. So the first one is labeled guest. Feel free to unmute yourself or type your question in the chat and see what we can do. So,
there you go. Thank you. I just
you're welcome.
Hi, I'm sorry, I forgot to type my name in. My name is Shalita Walker. I'm coming from up north in Toronto, Canada. And so I just want to thank you so very much for providing this opportunity. It's one of the conversations that I continue to struggle on my own journey as an anti-racist educator. And so I feel like as if I could probably listen to the recording 4 or 5 times. And I certainly think I need to engage with others to learn more. So I don't expect to get all my learning from you. So maybe some resources that I could examine and explore. But I really struggle a lot with trying to understand the Israeli-Palestinian dichotomy that exists and all of the layers and complications. And I know you shared quite a bit that I still think I need to unpack, and certainly some aspects that are new learning for me. So I don't want to speak as if I know. But I guess I'm just wondering, where do I begin to kind of engage in that conversation understanding, and how do I know that the perspectives that are being shared are wholesome and not perpetuating, I guess,
one side.
one side, or just even other stories. So I have spoken to colleagues who are Palestinian, and it was probably the first time, not last year, but I would say about 2 years prior, the first time that it even came into my radar. I've always approached anti-Semitism through that, from that experience of the Holocaust, the experience of, that kind of kumbaya, let's all get along sort of thing, not even acutely aware of the other bits. So where do I begin in my learning?
So I'm going to be contentious and say that everything you read is going to have a bias, including my talk tonight has a very specific bias. I think our organization does, but every organization does. Where I would begin is starting with what's out there. I'm going to, in the meantime, I'm going to look for a couple of things. There is some great work by Sam. I'm going to type this in the chat. Sami Atwan and Danny Baron. And they did something called So I had the opportunity of working with Sami Atwan when I was in Northern Israel doing my my own research. He is a Palestinian living in the north. He wrote and did a project with Danny Baron years ago, prior to Danny Baron's death, that tried to implement a curriculum in Israel that was as much as possible a dual narrative. So Danny Baron brought in the narrative on one side of the Israeli perspective on 1948 and some resources and so on. And then Sami Atwan wrote the Palestinian version. And they had done this for a number of things. That's where I would start, because it wasn't accepted. And it wasn't accepted because we also have to realize that Israel's government is right now very hawkish. It's a very protectionist government. And for people that were in my talk last night, it's also a mindset. Israel doesn't have an army. Israel doesn't have a military. Israel has a defense force. And so when you're brought up in a society, knowing that you're going to be conscripted to a defense force, there's a certain positioning within the region that you're led to believe. And so we look at things like the psychology of schooling and how we are indoctrinating each other. There's another one I'm going to have to look for, and I'm going to post a link in the chat, because it's about educators that are trying to teach as best as possible a dual narrative approach. I believe all narratives need to be welcomed into our classroom. The question is, and you had mentioned this, how do we know that the narratives we're using are not biased or inflammatory or so on? And that's where our own reading comes in. I would obviously selfishly say, check out the work on our organization, but again, there's a lens that we're writing through as well. So let me find a couple of resources in the meantime, and if we happen to be out of time, stick around and I'll post those sites directly into the chat, because I don't need things to stay the same. I need to make a better world for my children. And as I said to people in previous talks, I really hope that my own kids will ask me what war was like, and I need to turn to history textbooks, not breaking news. So there's no point in me reiterating, but then speaking about a need for change. Zainab. Sorry, do I need to unmute you? I think when I muted everybody, it may have overridden that. So can we do that? Can you unmute now?
Yeah, I can. Okay, so okay, so I also have two questions. Okay, so my first question is, I understand the Palestinian perspective. I think because I've heard, the thing is state, and I think I was taught that the one state now that's there is just it's Israel and the Palestinian people being there. So what we're taught is, how do we create a state that's fair, and then to me, I don't want to get in between the issues, but sometimes when you hear so much of the of one side struggle, I feel which is the Palestinian struggle, I then don't know the Israel struggle. Does that make sense to you? I only know one struggle, and it makes me feel bad that I don't know the other struggle. I don't know why are we not having if we're having one state solution, why not both sides be equal, both be let it be a country of two states, or I don't know what it is. That makes sense. And the second question I had is I was thinking about when you were talking about white passing, is there such thing as a glass ceiling? So one thing that we think of whiteness is that white people can get any job they want, do anything they want. And usually we think racialized people, there's like a glass ceiling. There's like a glass ceiling for women. There's a glass ceiling for racialized bodies. Is there a glass ceiling for the Jewish community? Because if it's not, that's why people assume there is complete whiteness, because they think, are you going to be stopped by getting the job? I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that was something that was in my mind, which I wanted to share. Sorry.
That's interesting. So the one piece that I always throw back at people, and you're in my class, so you're going to hear this quite a bit, is I love the work of Frantz Fanon. So I'm gonna, if you're looking for great reading, and I know some of you have lent my copy to, this to me is one of my defining texts. Because for me, this was an awakening. For those of you who are not familiar with Fanon, he was a Martinique-born psychiatrist, I believe, who did a lot of writing about the Algerian struggles and the efforts and the rebellions to separate from France and so on. But he ended up immersing himself in the bourgeoisie of Paris. He married a white woman. He taught at the university. He had a high-level job. He, for all intents and purposes, was white, right? In term, not by color, but by position in society. And he was on a subway one day, and there was a child who turned to his mother, or her mother, and said, "Look, Mom, A," and used the N-word. And it was that moment that he realized that no matter how hard he tries, he will never be equal. So even though he has a black skin, he wears this white mask. And so when we talk about functionally white, there is no doubt that as a cis-normative, white, straight, whatever male, I have been afforded certain privileges. It has. And it wasn't until I went to university and I was basically explained what that meant. It's not that I chose them. They happened to be me. But I also grew up in a very monocultural community where everybody looked like me. Everybody was Jewish. What we did was just normal, right? Everybody went on vacation to New York or Miami or Israel every year. That was normal. And it was when I went to the university did I realize that this normativity wasn't shared equally. And so I'll be the first to say, sure, I don't mind, cameras in our schools. I don't mind, carding. But again, I'm speaking of someone who's never been on the receiving end. So when we look at things like racism, and I want to be very clear, when we talk about Muslim experiences, and specifically our Palestinian students, they have very different experiences and very different ways of understanding the curriculum if their stories are not the normative. So is there a glass ceiling that can be broken? I believe in love and unicorns. So of course I'm going to say yes, but I'm not sure that in reality, we're going to have this kumbaya moment where we're all equal. I think it's a nice speech. It's nice to talk about big tent inclusivity. But in reality, outside of the four walls of a school, I don't think society really wants that. Mary, I just asked you to unmute because I know there's something you wanted to say.
I did. I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make about being white, in your case white, but yet considered to be Jewish and therefore not as white as the normal idea, I suppose, of white. Here in Ireland, for many centuries, we were predominantly a nation of white people, but yet for centuries, we suffered our own oppression. And when in 1845, we had the famine, and thanks to people like the Choctaw Indians and the Turkish king, money was sent to the Irish. But if we went to Britain, and I say this as someone who was born in the UK, if we went to Britain, there were signs all over in the 1900s and that blacks, dogs, and Irish need not apply. So even though we were a country of all white inhabitants, we were differentiated because 1, we were Irish, 2, by our accent, 3, by our religion, because for many, like the Jewish people, we had to hide our Irishness, we had to hide our Catholicism for centuries and practice, and we weren't allowed to use the Irish language in courts. People died, they were hanged because they weren't allowed interpreters. But they were all white, but it was a different sort of white. And it was all based on the fact that they had a different language, a different ethnicity, a different culture, they were from a different country. So when you say that white privilege, it all depends on where you come from and who you are, whether you're considered to be amongst the privileged white class. Because I think it's wrong to use the blanket phrase white privilege, because not all white people are privileged.
Yeah. Absolutely, and we see different even hierarchies about, and I use the term, when I think of white supremacy, I think of rednecks, and that is done intentionally because there is that, that diversity within even the blanket white society, that we have different groups, even within Judaism, for example, whereas I may see myself as white, right? I come across an Orthodox Jew who they may see themselves as Jewish first. And so while I have an attachment to Canada and my society and inclusivity and so on, the way that we create communities has to be very distinct. So just to go back to the previous question, I posted 3 resources there. The first one is by Rethinking Schools, and it looks at specifically independence or catastrophe and the story of a teacher that asks almost the exact same question. How do I teach this? Right? And so can we teach stories? In this case, this teacher looks at the story of Palestine, right? Can we teach this through multiple perspectives? What would that look like? Because what would this look like is crucial for teachers. The second piece was the Danny Barrow and Sami Atwan piece. They have 2 books. One where they take a series of defining events in history. So the first one being on like 1948 and Yom Kippur and so on. So it looks at Balfour Declarations, the 48 War, 1987's first Palestinian Intifada, and it's written in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And the PDF is there for you to download. Booklet 2 looks at the interconnectivity and shared history between Israelis and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians in the 1920s, 1930s, and the 1967 war. Booklet 3, coming in Arabic and Hebrew only, so you'd have to speak one of those, looks at the interconnectivity in specifically the 1950s, 1970s, 1990s. So we need to better ourselves in providing, not alternative, but what I'd say is intersecting narratives. The thing is, history in the Middle East is still happening. Bernie Lewis said that it is very fluid. The war between Israel and Hamas, and I'm doing that intentionally because it wasn't a war between Israel and Palestine. because Israel and Hamas reignited, brought to the mainstream, to the forefront, 48, 67, first Intifada, second Intifada. That's what became relived. It is people today that have adoptively witnessed the histories of their parents and grandparents, whether it's on the Israel side or the Palestinian side. So it's not that we need to perpetuate and trump up one narrative. It's how do these stories intersect? So, and then the third resource is something that every teacher should have. It's called the QR chart, right? And so it's just a link there, and it identifies about 20 some different ways that we can teach our students to ask questions at a functional level, predictive level, analytical, and an application or synthesis level. So while reading and learning about these intersecting histories, we can ask the appropriate questions. Like, how did we get here? I want you to remember that history in the Middle East is still happening, meaning that every hiccup today brings to light 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, as if it was yesterday. And because their history is so intractable, it is fresh. And we focus on making peace at a political level in areas like the United Nations, when what we should be doing is focusing on true stakeholders, the children, the parents, the teachers in the trenches. Adam, are you able to unmute yourself or? No. Okay. Can you do it now? There you go.
Yeah, now we're good. I was writing a paper for a lot of the talk. I was only able to absorb a lot of, like, some of the concepts you were talking about were
like most of my students, so we're okay.
Pretty hard to really understand while you were saying them. But there was the one part where you mentioned about when we were just getting into, like, where do Jews fit in on the pyramid of, where white people are at the top and, racialized people are at the bottom. How you have, well, we have the privilege of hiding, in my case, the high, or, even like stupid, like, sweaters that I bought on my trip to Israel, and how we have the privilege of hiding those things in public spaces where we feel we might not get the response we want to them. And, I know you're at York, and, how deeply do you think that applies at our school? Because it's easy to talk about, well, not easy, but to talk about such a general thing as the world, like we were today, like the whole Middle Eastern region, or all white people, or all Jewish people. But how can I apply that on, like, this micro level of at my own school, or in my, in my own just outing downtown? Like, is there a good reason to exercise that privilege, or is it just like, hold your head high, keep them again David out, keep the seat out, keep your keepa on? Like, how do we apply what we talked about today to our actual lives, like out at York or in Toronto?
So the first thing that I would say is that there's always comfort in groups. So I grew up in Thornhill. Thornhill is the largest diaspora of Jews in Canada. We make up, I think, approximately 40% or 30% of Canada's Jewish population. Many of us are so insular that we'll never leave Thornhill, to the point where we joke that we move from one street to another. Within Thornhill, and now I'm going to speak in very specifics, and I wrote a paper on this called A Walk in Both Worlds, where, I did what everyone else did. I have the Bazooka Joe t-shirt that I bought in Jerusalem. I would go for dim sum, BBYO dances, like the normal stuff. And I always felt safe because I never knew anything different. And I assume And this is an assumption that, so Zainab, I'm going to call you out because you're in my class and I always call you out, that I imagine that, Zainab, you probably have grown up with other people that share similar values, culture, religion, or so on. I could be wrong because my wife is the total opposite. She didn't. But there's an air of safety. But how safe do we feel when we leave that comfort? Right? For me, it's easy that I can just take off a kippah. I can hide my chai or my AZA or my B whatever sweatshirts. But on one hand, should I? And then the other piece is you have to ask yourself about the safety. And unlike any other conflict, and again, I'm not sure that that's true, but I am going to say it, that unlike any other conflict, everybody has an opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You're either on one side or the other, or silent, and silent usually because of safety. So I tell people, yeah, hold your head up high. Be proud of who you are. Not be proud just because you are one thing or another. But at the end of the day, we always have to consider safety first. And, you know, I live in a community now, and I posted this on my Instagram yesterday because I was told maybe I'm reading too much into it. So somebody posted, and I can try to share the picture on a street post. Yesterday was the first day in 6 months I had a day to myself, where I, you know, go figure. And I'm going to try to find the picture in the meantime, where somebody decided to spray paint this to a light post. Let's see if I can find it. And the question is that while I live in what I consider to be a very safe neighborhood, I'm going to post this into the, can I? It takes you to my Twitter page, so maybe that's done intentionally. Post it here. No, so I'm going to share my screen. And son of a gun. Okay, my computer froze. I'll be back in a moment. Hello again. Share my screen. So, Zainab, are you able to see my screen? Okay, so this was spray painted onto the light post down the street from my house. I can hide my kippah, I can hide my Jewish star, I can hide my tzitzit, I can hide my beliefs. But we talk about safety. Somebody said, I'm probably reading too much into this. Now I know what I see. You're allowed to disagree, but to me, I see a Jewish star with a skull in the middle. I don't know. The problem is that this picture this is the whole light post. So I find it odd. So we talk about safety and community, but what happens when our communities are infiltrated? And at the same time, no matter how safe I might feel in my community as a racialized or non-racialized body, as soon as I leave that comfort of my community, am I as safe as I was? And that's the big question. I'm gonna stop sharing here. And Zainab, did you have a question?
I do. I have a question. I think the biggest problem that I always face is that you can live in Toronto. Like I've lived here since my parents came when I was 5 years old, 1992 till now. And I can't tell you if I know a Jewish person like I don't know one. And I've lived since 1992. How long is that? That's been like 28 years. And I came when I was 5 years old. So, you know,
yeah.
So I think the biggest issue is we don't know each other. All I know is Muslims. You know, I don't know. And even though I wish we created like an organization. Like I'm interested in Jewish culture. I want to know what Shabbat is. I've never experienced it. I do think we're so fascinated by your culture, but we feel like we don't know it. And at some point it becomes strange to us in that we like I think in order to create more peace, there has to be more dialogue between each other. And so how do we create that dialogue? Because my daughter's 3 years old. I don't want her to grow up not knowing a Jewish person. I find that very, very sad. And vice versa. I don't want your children to not know Muslims. And so I do think in terms of just because I do think ignorance is from being hate comes from ignorance, and to not hate is to be informed. And the more I learn about Jewish cultures like Shabbat and and Jewish religion in terms of Holocaust and Rosh Hashanah and all, the more I learn, the more I appreciate, the more I think, wow, these people have such a strong culture. They take kosher so seriously. They know, and I do think we need to see the beauty in your religion and your beauty in your culture, and we will only see that by you guys sharing more. So I understand you. I think you guys need to share more and understand that some people want to know more, but they don't know how to. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm.
It does. And so the truth is that I spent the majority of my day today on the phone with the Ministry of Education. Everything you're saying, I think on one hand, it's heartbreaking that you've never met, and I do believe this, and you've never knowingly, let's put it that way, you've never knowingly met someone who's Jewish. And for the same thing, like growing up in Thornhill, I didn't have Muslim friends, right? And so that to me is tragic, because it's super important that my children realize that, and I don't mean this with disrespect, that I don't care what religion you are, because it shouldn't matter to our friendship. And so I was on the phone today for a solid 3 hours with the Ministry of Education, looking at how we can get the grade 11 world religions course as a mandatory course in high school. The same way that grade 9 geography is, or English, or math, or science, all of those follow us into a trajectory of mindfulness in terms of skills. But what about thought? When we're talking about the diversity of our classrooms, the diversity of our society, but learning about other cultures and religions is not mandatory, to me, I think sets us up for much of the same. If I had learned about world religions, right? If I had learned about, Islam and Baha'i and Christianity, even still today, I don't know the difference between Protestant, Anglican, Christian. To me, it's all the same, but it's not. That I begin to see people not just for what they are, but who they are, and who they are as a whole, right? The way I think, the way I live my life is based on the fact that my dad is born in a camp in 1945. My father is born at the tail end of the Holocaust. So I was brought up through a lens of stick to your own because everyone else wants to kill you, because look what I was born into. It took me 30 years to be able to disagree with them. I wonder, though, if we expose children beyond platitudes of saying, oh, we need to do this, expose them through education to teach about culture and religion. And, when I see the world, when you see the world, it's different. And so when we talk about indigeneity and we talk about indigenous knowledges and pathways, I see the world based on my upbringing and vice versa. Isn't that an important trait to then bring into our own classrooms? So it was a long conversation with a lot of, you can't do that. So I love when people say, I can't do it, I try harder. Mm-hmm. Next, I'm going to go to Evelyn and Joel. So you should have seen something that says, and Shelley had mentioned, there's a wonderful organization, the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. Absolutely. I've never worked with them personally. I've heard of them. And so please, these are the types of organizations that really speak to dual narratives, bringing others and similars together for a common cause. So that's a great one, right?
Okay, can I speak now?
Yes. Evelyn.
Okay, can I speak now? Zainab,
Yes.
I am very interested in probably inviting you to an organization. It's called the Interfaith. Oh, my bird is just screaming like crazy. I'm gonna go to another room. So it's called an interfaith. I happen to be a Reformed Jew, but I am a convert to Judaism. I was a Catholic from when I was born from another country, and I married a Jew. I converted. I have practiced Judaism for 41 years, and I belong to a Reformed Judaism, Reformed congregation. So there's different congregation in Judaism. There's the Reformed, the Orthodox, and the Conservative. The Reform where I belong sits right next to a Muslim temple.
Synagogue.
And the temple and the Jewish temple that we have a very strong friendship. And we have established an interfaith relationship, not only with the Muslims, but also with the Zoroastrian, all kinds of other religion. And every year we invite them and we go to the services that they have. And I would, one of these days, Neil, I would get the information, and I would love you to come and come into some of our evening where we have the Shabbat services. And I became very, very involved with the religion, and I actually sing in the choir. So I learned how to read Hebrew. I have zero information about the Jews, only that when I was growing up, I was taught in my religion that the Jews killed Jesus Christ. But when I came to Canada, I went myself and tried to study why is it that the narrative was that the Jews were the people that killed Jesus Christ. And through my learning and through reading some of the books, because I was interested, I ended up learning more. And when I had my business, my first person that I hired for my business was a Muslim guy, and him and I used to have beautiful conversation, and we learned from each other. And it's true that through conversation and trying to educate ourselves, and I believe my husband, my late husband, believed that joining organizations like this is very important, because we believe in educating. Education is number one. And I support all the education institution that promotes diversity. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Building on that, and Evelyn, that's a great point. And I also look at being invited one day, Evelyn, because I know you and I have spoken. One of the activities I used to do as a geography teacher in my world issues course was we used to rent a bus, and now knowing that buses are a lot more expensive, we used to take the entire class to different places, not just a church, a synagogue, a mosque, but we looked also, and who was it? Shelley talked about Reconstructionists. We went to an Orthodox, well, we couldn't go into the Orthodox synagogue, but an Orthodox, a Reform, an Anglican church, a Protestant church, or this mosque or that mosque. And so that students began to look at it as architecture and similarities. And then we talked about creationist stories, right? And the interconnectivity. I think the one thing I've learned from my now Muslim friends is a shared love of food and Middle Eastern dishes, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what it all comes down to. So earlier, somebody had wrote, are Jews collectively white, non-white, a race? And if not, why not? So that's a twofold question. When somebody asks me what I am, I say Jewish. Most people would say Canadian. I say Jewish, because to me, it's like you're asking and I'm outing myself, and then I get all nervous and like, oh my God, what did I just say? But we have this idea. When we talk about the race, on one hand, the Ashkenazi or the white Jew is seen as a collective, whereas the non-white Jews are usually seen as othered, not. But I had earlier mentioned it was a 1991 Canadian census. I was incorrect. It was the 2001. And this is the question that was on the 2001 census that hopefully answers that question. So I'm going to just lower this for a sec. In the 2001 census, question 17 asked, and this is word for word, while most people in Canada view themselves as Canadians, information on their ancestral origins have been collected since 1901 census to capture the changing composition of Canada's diverse population. Therefore, this question refers to the origin of the person's ancestors. So question 17, to which ethnic or cultural groups did this person's ancestors belong to? For example, Canadian, French, English, Chinese, Italian, German, Scottish, Irish, Cree, Mi'kmaq, Métis, Inuit, Eskimo, scratch your head on that one, East Indian, Ukrainian, Dutch, Polish, Portuguese, Filipino, Jewish, Greek, Jamaican, Vietnamese, Lebanese, Chilean, Somalian, and so I have my answer. Tucked neatly between Filipinos and Greeks, the Canadian government in 2001 considered Judaism our collective ethnicity, our ancestry. That's 20 years ago. And so we then get into the questions of, again, so what privileges come with whiteness and where do we fit? That to me sort of frames those questions. I'm going to ask unmute here. We have a couple more questions. So if you can unmute yourself, go ahead.
Hi, Neil. I just have a few comments to make in terms of the discourse that has occurred just in its last few minutes. And so I just want to call upon Glenn Singleton's 4 agreements in talking about race for courageous conversations. And so I'm hoping that we can just honor those 4 agreements as I share my thoughts, if you wouldn't mind. Do I
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I want to put a caution when we talk about teaching about culture and faith in schools. It has a tendency sometimes to lead towards romanticizing people's race and identity and negating some of the significant struggles, atrocities, and challenges that have occurred. And I think it also further isolates the real and contemporary contributions that such identities bring. So if we highlight, for example, mosques or synagogues, and we look at the scripts and we look at the stories, etc., it romanticizes an experience of a group. It doesn't give the lens of not just the traumas and tribulations and the trials that have and continue to occur under the realms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but it also doesn't apply some of the historical and contemporary contributions and excellence within those identities. And so I worry that it rather than using that as a focus, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogical practices that ask us to really and truthfully, not from the culture of people, but really and truthfully setting some very high expectations and standards for learning. We are rooting our learning where children come into classrooms and see themselves represented in all aspects of their learning. And so, because I will say that Indigenous peoples will not ask for culture to be taught. That is one area that they've asked us to stay out of, and to really, under the Truth and Reconciliation, ask us to kind of, look at the impacts of residential schools, but to also think about what are those contemporary ways in which Indigenous peoples continue to exist and find ways to thrive in today's society. So
I would agree with you 100%, especially. And so for that, I would have to go to the curriculum because, you know, like I said, I'm calling for world religions being a mandatory course. And a lot of that I'm also leaving up to the qualified educator to be able to engage in culturally relevant conversations, culturally responsive pedagogies, and bring in that anti-oppressive lens, but also that religion is not, you know, in isolation of a people. So when we talk about the contributions, and I know that as one example, the Aga Khan, I'm going to call it museum, does a great job with highlighting some of the contributions that I don't like the term sect, so please correct me, of Islam focuses on and contributions made to the science, to the music, and so on. And that becomes a larger piece within the conversation of religion, not just, you know, the Prophet Muhammad or Jesus and so on, and the intersections of them. So I would agree with you as well. And, you know, going on, as I mentioned, the field trip is not meant to, hey, look at how we're all the same, but also then talk about who within these stories, because they're not all, you know, roses and so on. When we're talking about intersecting between Judaism and Christianity, there are conversations about, did Jews kill Christ, right? That's not a very comfortable conversation to have in a classroom. And it's definitely going to jokingly refer to, you know, the future of your career as a career limiting move. Then need to then consider how we can then not only celebrate difference, but also then come to know. So I love that you brought in this idea of culturally responsive and culturally responsive and responsive pedagogies. I'm going to post a link here. I'm just trying to find the right one that Edutopia wrote an article 2 years ago, is where we can get started. Please note that this is just a getting our feet wet approach, not a this is the say all and end all. Right, the same way that you had asked, you know, where do I start with conversations in the classroom about Israelis and Palestinians? Where do I start with culturally responsive pedagogies and teaching? So I do appreciate that question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any others? Zainab? Sorry, you can't unmute. There you go. So I've learned this new trick. If I mute everybody, you can't unmute, which is terrible.
Okay, so the question that I have is that I know that when somehow I watched Unorthodox. I don't know if you guys watched the Netflix film, but to be honest with you, I watched it, my family watched, my sister watched, and I do believe the problem is when we don't know your story, we look to the media to see anything. And I do think we need to know Judaism, not from the media and not from Unorthodox, which probably is just one story, but necessarily from you guys. So I do think more conversation needs to happen of how do we learn, because even if I teach it, I feel like I have a hard time teaching it because I don't know it. You know what I'm saying? So I want to know as much so that I can teach it.
So one of the things that I would say there is always be careful teaching someone else's story. I am not in a position to teach not only not your story, but, you know, the stories that are not mine. And so for that case, that's where we look to our board, our superintendents, our vice principals, our principals, for best practice, but also the names of people that can speak relevantly and appropriately for other groups. The funny thing is I watched Unorthodox, and that's not a sect of Judaism that I follow. I'm not of that. But then I watched, there was a Netflix show that was terrible. It's a reality show about really rich, super rich Jews. And I just shook my head at it, but I watched it right after Unorthodox. And to me, again, that was trivializing, that was romanticizing the world. Always be careful. I made a point to say that the lens tonight that I used was my lens, and it's what's propelling me. But when I speak to anti-Semitism, I am very well aware that anti-Semitism is not the only hate in the city. I don't even need to go weeks to find something. I'm sure I can open up a newspaper from yesterday and find, you know, Islamophobic attacks, against the LGBTQ plus community, and like it's not far. So for me, on behalf of the Abraham Global Peace Initiative, yes, we are founded in a belief system that you can't understand or fully appreciate human rights education without understanding the effects of the Holocaust, with a caveat for me as a teacher that Jews weren't the only people that perished in the Holocaust. And that's an important piece to remember. Yes, we were the largest proportion of people, but we weren't the only people. And so out of the Holocaust, you have the United Nations. Out of the Holocaust, you have the Geneva Convention. Out of the Holocaust, you have A, B, and C. And so we use that. And I'm going to talk about a community in a second. Adam was my student in high school. Dana, who's here, was a student of mine in high school. I worked in Thornhill. We started conversations through a lens of the Holocaust because that was the community. And we then scaffolded other experiences through that lens, not as a oppression Olympics approach, but we need to understand what happened in Darfur, in Rwanda, in Srebrenica, in Korea, but we can understand it by what happened to us first. I would never do that in other communities. I would look at their history, and we use those communities, and those, I mean, the communities we're working in, and build a foundation based on their lived experiences. But I'm not an expert beyond my community and my experience. So that's where that caveat came in, that I'm not pro-Palestine as much as I'm not pro-Israel. I'm not pro-Canada. I don't know what that means, right? Like during the World Cup, I cheer for the Dutch. Sorry, Mary. You know, I cheer for teams that I think will win, but I don't say, yay, I don't know, I'm pro-peace, right? And to understand and recognize that, I have to realize, any good educator, we realize we're not the gatekeepers of knowledge, right? I've said on the first day, I'm a Sherpa, I'm going to lead you on a journey, but as much as I have to teach you, there's a lot of learning I need to have done as well. It's a mouthful. That's probably why my mouth is so dry. Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to throw in my email address there, although you would have got a confirmation. I think my computer froze again, of course. If you do have any questions, you want to chat more, even if you want resources, send me an email, task me with helping you find them, right? If you're worried that something is overly biased, I would never say don't use it. I would then say just try to find an opposing bias that centers it or anchors it, and then use things like cue charts to find that third story, your side, my side, and then the truth. I think bias is important to not only recognize, but as a tool of media literacy, we need to be able to identify bias. So on that note, thank you all very much for joining me tonight. For some of you, it is very late, so go to sleep. It's very late for me as well, but not as late as others. I will be sending out information on our November 1st speaker series on Indigenous creation stories. Definitely not my background, so I'm not the one talking. But I do invite you to check out our website, agpi.ca. There, if you go under the Academy section, we're having a global summit on anti-Semitism. And just with that, have a wonderful night. I would say drive carefully, but you should all be at home. And as someone who bought me this mug today says, like I said, spread hummus, not hate. Okay. Have a wonderful night. Take care. Thank you. Take care. Thank you very much. Cheryl, are you there? IJV, are you there?